The final question focuses on a topic of week 6, international and domestic terrorism. And the question is, why do we learn the CIA definition of terrorism rather than the UN one? The definition that I was using in the lecture slides is not one I took from the CIA or any particular source. It is kind of de facto in the terrorism literature, and the literature is what the textbook is based on, and I made sure that my definition was consistent with the one in the book. I'm not aware, well, I know that the US has a list of state sponsors of terrorism and groups that use terrorism, but I didn't look at that before I came up with the definition, and the United Nations doesn't have a straightforward definition of terrorism. It's interesting. It's been trying to come up with a definition that the international community finds standard and that would be enforced under international law. But to date, as far as I'm aware, there is no internationally agreed upon definition of terrorism. And there is some information online, different reports, and from the United Nations efforts at trying to come up with a definition. They mostly stalled because of two reasons. One is that some states want to include actions of states instead of non-state actors. The definition that I had in week 6 is the use of violence against citizens by a non-state actor. So the three important things is the use of violence, the fact that it is non-combatants who are the targets of the violence, and that it is by non-state actors instead of state actors. Though some would say that non-uniformed military or governmental personnel using this kind of violence would also fall into this definition because they're not identifiable as state actors. The UN basically has faltered on whether state action should be included in this definition. Most people in the literature as well as in the press focus on the use of violence by non-state actors, which is why I use this. But some want to say that the use of techniques consistent with this definition of the use of violence against civilians should be included, the use of states. The second issue is whether the use of violence against civilians by people motivated by self-determination should be considered terrorism. In the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, there were some groups that were trying to seek independence or separation, kind of showing the overlap between civil war and terrorism. And there's a debate about whether these self-determination movements, their technique should be considered terrorism or just movement towards independence. And that's also proved to be a sticking point. And I think this discussion, if it leaves you with one takeaway point, it is that terrorism is an emotionally evocative word. It's used by different actors for political purposes, and one group's terrorist would be another's freedom fighter, and that different people have used the lack of a clear definition for their own ends to either justify their actions and punish the actions of others, or show that the actions of others are beyond the pale. So it is a political topic, and the definition that I've used is consistent with the literature in that it's focused on the actions of non-state actors. Governmental repression, violence would be something distinct and separate, even though the techniques or the effect on civilians might be similar. But what we're looking at in this week's lecture was violence used by non-state actors in a civil war context or a terrorism context. So hopefully that answers your question.